Super listeners sure like the ads. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. Edison Research released their Super Listeners study with Ad Results Media. Super listeners are US adults who listen to 5 or more hours of podcasts a week. And they're listening to podcasts longer and pay more attention to ads on podcasts than other media. However, 22% say there are way too many adverts, a figure up from 18% a year ago. Over half super listeners have listened to podcasts on YouTube, by the way, and 19% say that's their primary way of discovering new shows. Edison Research also released their first US top podcast networks ranker. The data looks at all of 2021, measuring total reach. SXM Media is number 1 for podcasts, the data finds, which is also what the latest Triton Digital US podcast ranker, based on server logs, says. We've tracked this space, says Tom Webster, for 10 quarters with thousands of listeners, and the data we see has been incredibly stable over that period of time. How much did Spotify license the Joe Rogan podcast for? The New York Times reports that the 3.5-year deal was over $200 million, not the $100 million that everybody's been reporting till now. Want to work with your favourite podcast? Now you can. Kind of. Anyone can claim to be a creator of any podcast within the Good Pods app without any proof or validation, we've discovered. Danny Brown made himself a creator of Podnews' podcast on the app to prove it could be done, and I made myself a creator for Danny's podcast for a short while. We'd suggest, firstly, don't do this, and secondly, more importantly, all apps should respect creators and never allow unauthorized changes. JJ Ramberg from Good Pods tells us that this violates the Good Pods terms of service, which states that the company may immediately terminate your Good Pods account, and you may also be subject to civil or criminal penalties. Podcast host Ausha has launched a complete social media management tool and says it's the first in the world to do so. Ausha's connected to Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. iHeartMedia has signed with Veritone to use synthesized voices to translate shows into different languages. They'll start in the Spanish market. And if that sounds familiar, it's because Brian Barletta from our AdTech newsletter Sounds Profitable has been using this technology to host a podcast in Spanish, in spite of not speaking the language. The full programme for next week's Podcast Futures Conference in London, hosted by Podcast Radio, has been announced, featuring presentations and panellists from Triton Digital, Veritonic, Edison Research and Acast. The Good Life Project has joined Acast. The series celebrates its 10th anniversary this year. And the BBC's radio, music and podcast app, BBC Sounds, now lets users control your own play queue. If you're on iOS, that is. Android users get this feature, as ever, soon. The corporation blocks its shows on Google Podcasts, and the BBC is removing some of its newer episodes from open podcast apps in favour of the BBC Sounds app. And have you filled in our report card for the big podcast platforms yet? We would really appreciate it. We've got over 100 responses already, and some of the feedback is so useful. Podnews.net/report card is where to go. And thanks. And in People News, Indira Burney has been hired as Head of Marketing and Communications for Novel. She was with Penguin Random House and used to work on the Penguin podcast, moving from novels to novel. And Terence Moore has joined the Believe podcast network as Head of Talent. He was with WME. And in podcast news, Deeply Human from the BBC World Service, American Public Media and iHeartMedia returns for a new season with writer and musician Dessa. The podcast is an exploration of human behaviour, instincts and culture. And that's the latest from our newsletter. To read all the stories in full and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.